Okay, let's just jump right into this incredible paradox.
Let's do it.
We're talking about ancient Egypt, a civilization that built these, staggering monuments, but it was all happening in one of the most hostile places on Earth.
Right in the middle of a vast, scorching desert.
So how does a society like that even survive, let alone get rich and powerful?
Well, the whole story really comes down to the Nile River. That's the answer.
Okay.
The entire civilization existed on this incredibly narrow strip of green land right along the river.
And outside of that strip?
Just
Yeah.
nothing. Uninhabitable desert. The land was way too dry. There was almost no rain.
So their survival depended entirely on this one single event.
Exactly. The annual flood of the Nile. It's why historians call the whole region the gift of the Nile. It's not an exaggeration.
So what was so special about this flood? I mean, floods are usually destructive.
Well, the key here was its predictability. It wasn't random. It was like clockwork.
And where did all that water even come from? It's a desert.
It started thousands of miles south. Every summer, between June and September, you'd get these massive monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands.
Ah, okay.
And that sent a huge surge of water rushing north. And the critical thing is it happened every single year, without fail.
So it wasn't just the water they needed, but what the water brought with it?
Precisely.
Yeah.
When the floodwaters finally went back down, usually by October, they left behind this thick layer of really rich, dark earth.
That's the famous silt.
That is the silt. In fact, the Egyptians called their own land Kemet, the Black Land, because of that dark soil, not the desert around it.
And this wasn't just any soil. The silt was packed with minerals, right?
Yeah.
Things scoured from volcanic rocks way upriver.
Exactly.
Okay.
Potassium, magnesium, all the good stuff. It was so nutrient dense that, unlike almost everyone else in the ancient world, they barely needed to rotate their crops.
Wow.
But, this amazing gift also came with a huge risk.
It wasn't guaranteed to be perfect every year.
No. The farmers were watching the water levels like hawks. If the flood was too low, huge parts of the plain wouldn't get watered or get that layer of silt.
And that means famine.
Widespread famine. But the opposite was just as dangerous. A flood that was too high could be a destructive monster.
It would just wipe everything out.
It would sweep away their canals, their homes. These little wet brick houses just couldn't stand up to it.
So this whole cycle, this reliable engine, allowed them to build a stable food supply where there should have been nothing.
And understanding the timing of that flood was the most important skill a farmer could possibly have.
Okay, so the flood recedes, the soil is perfect, but the work is just beginning.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because now the river level starts to drop, especially in the dry season.
Leaving the fields high and dry.
Right. And that was the central challenge of their daily lives.
Yeah.
How do you get water from the low river up to the high fields?
I'm picturing a really exhausting process.
It was. At first, workers just carried these heavy clay pots or leather buckets back and forth up and down a slippery riverbank.
That sounds agonizingly slow.
It was, and so exhausting. You couldn't possibly water a large field that way. It really limited how much they could grow.
Which I imagine led to a major innovation.
It did, the invention of the Shedouf. This was a simple machine, but it was an absolute game changer for irrigation.
Okay, so break it down for us. What is a Shedouf?
It's a beautiful piece of simple physics. Basically, it's a long wooden pole balanced on a vertical frame, kind of like a big seesaw.
A seesaw, okay.
On one end, the river end, you have a big bucket, and on the other end, you have a huge, heavy counterweight, usually a big lump of dried mud or a heavy stone.
Ah, so the counterweight does the heavy lifting.
Exactly. That's the genius of it. Let's walk through how it works.
Yeah, let's see that.
The farmer stands on the bank. He pulls a rope down to lower the empty bucket into the river. He's working against that heavy stone.
Okay.
Once the bucket's full of water, he just lets go.
And the weight on the other end just pulls the full bucket up automatically.
The physics takes over. The heavy counterweight swings down, and the full bucket of water comes right up. The farmer isn't lifting the water, he's just guiding the pole.
So one person could move so much more water with way less effort?
A huge difference. They could work longer without getting exhausted or injured. We think one person with a Shedouf could irrigate maybe 2 or 3 acres in a day.
That's a massive increase.
Oh, easily 10 times more than just carrying buckets.
Yeah.
But lifting the water was only the first step.
Right, because you still have to get it to fields that might be miles away from the river.
And that's where you see this huge public infrastructure project. A massive network of canals.
So the water from the Shedouf flows into these man-made channels.
A whole complex system of canals and smaller ditches that they dug into the earth. They called it basin irrigation.
How did they control where the water went?
With little dirt walls called dikes. They could open or close them to direct the flow into certain fields or keep water out.
Maintaining all of that couldn't have been a one-person job.
Absolutely not. This required the whole community. Digging the ditches, clearing out the silt that built up every year.
Yeah.
It was a required task, something called corvée labor.
A community tax, but paid in work.
Exactly. And the fact that this system worked proves they had a strong central government that could organize labor on a massive scale.
So with all this water and fertile soil, what were they growing? What was fueling this whole civilization?
The two undisputed champions were wheat and barley.
Bread and beer.
The absolute essentials. They were the main source of energy for everyone. And they were even used like money.
We have to talk about the beer. It wasn't just for fun, was it?
Not at all. It was a necessity. Egyptian beer was thick and full of calories. And because the Nile water could have pathogens, the beer, which was boiled, was often safer to drink.
And they paid people in it.
Oh yeah. The laborers who built the pyramids, their daily wages were paid in bread and beer.
So how did they plant the seeds? In that wet mud? It must have been pretty simple.
Very efficient. They just scatter the seeds by hand onto the wet ground. Then they drive cattle or goats over the field. The animal's hooves would just press the seeds down into the mud.
That's clever.
Super clever. Then harvesting happened in the spring with these curved wooden sickles that had sharp flint blades. After that, storage was everything.
You have to protect the harvest.
From moisture, from rats, from everything. They built these huge circular granaries out of mud brick to keep the grain safe. Their ability to store surplus was their insurance policy.
And it wasn't just grains. They had gardens too, right?
Oh, absolutely. They grew a ton of vegetables, onions, leeks, garlic, beans, lentils.
And what about fruits? It's hot there.
They loved things with high water content like melons and cucumbers.
Yeah.
And also figs, dates, and pomegranates. They even grew grapes on these wooden trellises, which gave them shade and wine.
Let's talk about the tools for a second. We mentioned sickles. What else?
Well, the most important tool was probably the plow. A simple wooden plow pulled by a pair of oxen. It didn't dig very deep, just enough to turn over that top layer of silt.
And for smaller jobs?
Hand hoes to break up clumps of dirt and get rid of weeds. And after the harvest, they use these big flat fans to toss the grain in the air.
Winnowing. So the wind blows away the light, useless bits.
Right, the chaff.
Right.
And leaves you with the heavy grain kernel.
And you mentioned oxen. Livestock must have been critical to the whole system.
They were the engine, oxen for plowing. Donkeys were the main pack animals carrying heavy loads across the desert.
And what about smaller animals?
Sheep and goats were essential for milk, meat, and wool. And farmers had to be really skilled at managing them, especially with the flood.
They'd have to move them all to higher ground every year.
Every single year. A huge logistical task. And of course, the animal manure was sometimes used to enrich the soil even more.
This whole massive productive system, it sounds like it needed a lot of central planning. Which brings us to the government's role.
Exactly. The pharaoh's entire authority was built on his ability to feed the nation. So the government kept incredibly detailed records.
And they had a way to predict the harvest, didn't they?
They did. They used a device called a nilometer.
A nilometer. How did that work?
It was basically a measuring stick for the river. It might be a staircase going down into the river or a deep well with markings on the side. Officials would use it to measure the exact height of the annual flood.
And that number told them everything.
It was their entire economic forecast for the year. A high number meant a big harvest and prosperity. A low number meant trouble.
So how did they use that information to control things?
It was an instrument of taxation. Based on that one measurement, the government could predict how big the harvest was going to be before a fungal seed was planted.
Wow.
Which meant they could calculate the taxes for every village immediately. Scribes would be sent out to count the bags of grain and make sure the state got its share.
No hiding the yield.
No hiding it. And that tax, that grain stored in the state's massive storehouses, was the foundation of the pharaoh's power.
So that surplus fed the army.
Fed the army, paid the wages for the pyramid builders, and, most importantly, it was used to feed the population in years when the flood was too low.
If the pharaoh couldn't feed his people, his divine right to rule would just crumble.
It would completely fall apart. This organized system, from the simple Shedouf all the way to the huge state granaries, is what kept the kingdom stable and powerful for 3,000 years.
It's incredible that surplus of food meant they could support people who weren't farmers.
Artists, priests, architects, soldiers.
Or people who built the pyramids.
Exactly. Without the success of their agriculture, the Great Pyramids probably would have never even been imagined, let alone built.
So the whole story of Egyptian agriculture is really about how clever inventions and really strong organization can turn a hostile environment into a garden.
It is. Their mastery of water, from the simple physics of a lever to the community management of canals, created a society that lasted for millennia.
It really makes you think, if their stability depended on a predictable annual flood, what hidden resource is our modern world completely dependent on? And what happens if its rhythm suddenly changes?
Something to think about. But now you know the science behind the green gift of the Nile.
Good luck with your studies!